Hello, everyone. This is Gilgamesh, and today we're looking at Isaiah chapter 4. So, just to recap what we talked about last episode, we talked a bit about how we know the meanings of different words because chapter 3 was full of them. And we talked about the city of Zion losing its leadership. The leaders of the city were oppressing the people, and they were oppressing the poor and the needy. And that was one of the main complaints that Isaiah had about them. Then we went into an extended metaphor about the daughters of Zion. They were depicted as worldly and vain, and they were then subject to harsh judgment that brought them to a place of humiliation and possibly even slavery. The metaphors seem to indicate that they would be stripped of their fine clothing and left sitting empty on the ground, perhaps with their hair cut off, perhaps branded as slaves. And then we ended it with talking about a final verse. And this verse seemed to relate more to that metaphor than it did to the one in chapter 4, which we'll talk about today. We're going to start by revisiting that and seeing maybe if that verse does belong in chapter 4, although it is very different than the verses that follow. Then we're going to talk about a special prophecy about the branch. And the branch is an interesting and somewhat mysterious figure that is found in Isaiah and several of the other prophets. We'll talk about the verses that talk about the branch. And we're then going to talk about these daughters from the last chapter that are going to be washed clean and brought into Zion again. And we're going to talk about the end state here, which involves a pillar of fire and maybe a wedding. So let's get into it. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 1 starts with this interesting verse. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. So this is an interesting thing. First of all, I do want to comment here that polygamy was well established in this time frame. And so the idea that it is 7 women is extraordinary in that 7 women are all at one time taking hold of one man, but it's not unprecedented for a man to have multiple wives. But the idea here is that the husbands are so scarce that there will be this 7-to-1 ratio of anyone worth calling a husband. And we saw this in the last chapter where there was this lack of leadership and they were looking for anyone to be in charge. Likewise here, the women are looking for someone to take away our reproach. Now, the word for reproach here is used a few times. The idea here is that it refers to being in a state of social disadvantage, whether that is being husbandless or being childless. These women want to restore themselves to what they see as their proper role in society, which is to be under an honorable household and with an honorable man as a leader of a family. And they don't have this. And so we have 7 of them taking hold of one person to try to give them this. And they're saying that they'll bring their own supplies, that it won't cost the man anything, but they want to be called by, or rather the Hebrew actually says under, your name. They want to have a name of honor associated with them, which they do not currently have. And that is the reproach that they want taken away. They are looking for some honorable family that they can join themselves with because they have found themselves without such support. For a woman in the ancient world, that was a tragedy. Without the support of an honorable household, it would be very unlikely that she would be able to support herself in anything other than the most extreme poverty. So does this belong in the chapter? We'll come back to this verse towards the end and see if it fits. But this idea does seem to fit very nicely with the daughters of Zion from the previous chapter, where it was talking about leaving them in this distressed and humiliated state. And so this seems to flow on from that. But we're going to see that even though the rest of chapter 4 is very upbeat and positive, this first somewhat negative verse might have an important role in this chapter. So we will see. We move on then to verse 2 in chapter 4, and it says, in that day The branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel and Judah. Now, the "and Judah" at the end here was added because this is what is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Our traditional text has lost that final word there that is "and Judah," but it seems like it probably does belong there and was simply lost by a copyist at some later point. So we are talking about those who have survived not only the northern kingdom of Israel, but also Isaiah's home state of Judah. In that day tells us that we are talking about a future point in time, and then the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. The word here that is translated as branch is a special one that seems to apply to a particular individual. But before we go there, let's talk a little bit about the formation of chapter 4 in general. Most translators and textual critics will read this short chapter as simply prose, but the diction is manifestly poetic. It uses words like nogah, which means effulgence, and that word occurs nowhere except in poetry. And so we have a couple of key words like that that make us believe that this is probably poetry, although with a looser meter than most of the other prophetic poems that we see. Then this Lord's branch comes out to us, and we have a definite idea of symbolism here. Now, one way to read this is that these are two parallel lines, and that the branch of the Lord is parallel with the fruit of the land. And that's certainly possible. But this word for branch is used in a few other places in the Hebrew Bible, and it seems to hold a specific meaning for an individual, perhaps a powerful king in the Messianic era. As we look at where this exact same word is used, we find it in two places in Jeremiah. This is not a terribly common word, but when it does show up, these are the things we see. Jeremiah 23:5, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. So we have this idea here of an individual that is going to come from the line of David, a righteous branch, and that he will reign as a king, which makes sense since the line of David is the royal dynasty line. But particularly, he's going to be wise and bring justice and righteousness. Then we have Jeremiah 33:15. It says, in those days and at that time, notice both these are all pointing to the future, just like the Isaiah verse did. I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. This is obviously a slightly shorter version of the previous verse in Jeremiah, but he's repeating this idea that there appears to be an individual coming from the line of David who will execute justice and righteousness. As we go to Zechariah, O Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who sit before you, for they are men who are a sign. Behold, I will bring my servant the branch. Now we're saying specifically this is a divine servant that is being referred to as the branch. Then a little later in Zechariah it says, and say to him, thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold the man whose name is the branch, for he shall branch out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Notice in Zechariah it has a much more religious function than it did in Jeremiah. Jeremiah emphasized the kingship. Here, Zechariah is putting him in with various high priestly functions. It is associating him with the building of the temple, and it has this nice little play on the title here that his name is the branch, and he's going to branch out. It also, though, does define him as a man whose name is the branch. So we have a lot of indication here that this, at least by later peoples, was understood to be an individual and not just referring to something about the agriculture of the land. If we take it not as about an individual, then you have to ask, what would it mean then to say that the branch of the Lord would be beautiful and glorious? What would be the branch of the Lord? Because the word does indicate an actual tree branch. And so what would make a branch be the branch of the Lord? Now, of course, a branch of a tree would make sense to be associated with fruit. And so the idea here of the fruit of the land will be pride and honor. So it is possible that branch and fruit of the land are parallel. It certainly seems that way. We have beautiful and glorious parallel to pride and honor. And this is particularly something that's going to be of use to those who have survived of Israel and Judah. So make of that what you will. There is this prophecy that the branch is going to be in that day. We're looking future, and this appears to be an individual. Oh, let me also say here that the word that is translated as branch here is not the same word that is translated as branch in Isaiah 11:1, where he's going to talk about the stump of Jesse and a new growth will come from it. That's a different word, although it may be the same imagery. Sometimes you don't have to use the exact same words, but in all the other verses that I just showed you, those were the exact same word for branch. There's a different word that is used in Isaiah 11:1. We'll revisit this when we get to chapter 11 to discuss the imagery as it shows up there. Moving forward then, Isaiah chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, continuing this idea of who is left behind. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem shall be called holy, everyone who is written for life in Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting here, between verse 2 and verse 3 here, we have used 3 different words in Hebrew to refer to these who are survivors or remnants of the Israel and Judah kingdoms. And so this is just part of Isaiah's mastery of language. He uses a large vocabulary and will frequently use synonymous words in close proximity to each other. And sometimes it's very difficult to render in English because often English doesn't have as many synonyms for the particular thing Isaiah is referring to as Isaiah is able to use. And so it can be a tricky thing for translators when you have 3 words that mean the remnant, and you have to come up with he who is left and remains and these survivors, just to try and come up with some variety to try and duplicate the variety that Isaiah himself used. Then we have this interesting idea, everyone who is written for life in Jerusalem. This could be an early reference to the concept of a book of life. This would become a common theme in rabbinic Judaism and also Christianity, the idea that there is some record kept and that people's names are written in that record, ascribing them to either life or salvation going forward. And so this seems to be that kind of an idea. So that those that are left in Zion and Jerusalem, they'll be called holy, which gives them a special religious status, and they're going to be written in some way for life. And then we come to the daughters of Zion again, and we have a nice little tight chiasm here. When the master shall have washed the filth of the daughters of Zion, and the blood of Jerusalem he will cleanse from her midst. So we have 2 halves of the line here. This is an obvious parallel, but the way it's arranged in Hebrew is you have a subject and verb, and then you have a direct object on the first part of the line, then you have the direct object, and then the verb afterwards on the second line. And so it often doesn't come across in translation, but this does form a nice, easy to spot chiasm in the Hebrew, where we have washed and cleansed, again, 2 words that are synonyms that mean largely the same thing, and they are parallel to each other. And then we have here the filth of Zion and the blood of Jerusalem parallel to each other in the center. So the idea here is that the daughters of Zion are being washed clean from the filth and the blood. And how is this being done? By a spirit of justice and by a spirit of burning. One thing to note here is the word that I translated as spirit here could also be translated as wind. It's the same word for both concepts. And so this could be by the winds of justice and by a burning wind. Actually sounds kind of cool, but that is also a completely legitimate translation of this. I also want to talk a little bit about this word justice. The Hebrew word is mishpat. It comes from a root that means to judge, and it is often brought into English translation as judgment. That's not a totally wrong translation, but it tends to connote in people's minds something negative. A lot of people hear that you should not judge others and so forth. And so when we say judgment, it often will bring to people's minds something negative, and that is not what the word is throughout the Hebrew Bible. When mishpat is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is always a positive thing, that judgment is what leaders are supposed to bring. And a better word that would capture that is the word justice. That's really what we mean by mishpat, that you're not just bringing judgment, but you're bringing judgment that is fair and what is deserving. Justice is a better translation than judgment almost everywhere you see it in the Hebrew Bible. So by the winds of justice and a burning wind, it's a perfectly legitimate translation for this. But this is what is going to make the daughters of Zion clean, is this spirit that indicates both justice and also the idea of burning, something that Isaiah will come back to many times as he talks about burning out impurities from people. So moving forward here to our last little bit, verses 5 and 6, we then have the conclusion of this rather short chapter. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. And over all the glory there will be a canopy, and there will be a booth for shade by day from the heat, and for a refuge and shelter from the storm and the rain. Well, let's look at this a little bit here. The Lord will create. The verb here is bara, which always indicates a divine type of creation. Humans cannot bara. Only divine beings can create in this manner. So the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion. Now, Mount Zion could refer to the entire city, but it typically, especially in Isaiah, refers to the temple. And if that wasn't clear enough, we have here, and over her assemblies. Assemblies, of course, were functions that tended to happen in the temple. So we are talking about a temple setting with this final thing here. So we've talked about the branch, we've talked about cleansing the daughters, and now we're talking about the temple here that is going to have a new creation with it. And the temple is often closely associated with creation. This is one of those verses that does associate that. And what is he going to create there? He's going to create what is clearly a reference back to the Exodus story of a cloud by day and smoke. Probably I should put and smoke on the line above. It seems to go more with the idea of a cloud, but a cloud by day and smoke, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. He embellishes the Exodus account here by adding a couple of extra terms. He uses poetic elaboration and adds both the word noga for shining, and he adds the word lahava for flame to describe this pillar of fire. And so we have the idea here of this pillar of cloud and pillar of fire that, of course, stood over the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. Here it is over Mount Zion at the temple, indicating the presence of God. We do have this interesting phrase then that follows, over all the glory. It's a somewhat obscure phrase. It's not something we see anywhere else. The least constrained construction of it is that it is a reference to the temple and the solemn assemblies from the previous verse. But then it has that there's going to be a canopy. The word for canopy is huppah. This is a fairly rare word in biblical Hebrew. It's only used a handful of times. And at least two of the other places where it's used, it refers to a marriage chamber. And in later Judaism, the same word is going to be the word that they use to describe a wedding canopy. And it may have that meaning here. It's quite possible that Isaiah has now turned to wedding imagery. And that here we have the idea that we have cleansed the daughters of Zion to be the brides. And that comes back to our opening verse here about 7 women wanting to take hold on one man so that they could be called in his name. This could be the conclusion to that they're being called up, they're being cleansed from the filth and the blood of Jerusalem, and they are being presented here at the temple into a wedding ceremony under a wedding canopy to be the brides now of Zion. And that this could be the imagery that we're talking about here. Maybe that first verse does belong where it's at. At a minimum, it seems to be that it is some type of a bridge between the previous section that talked about the daughters of Zion being humiliated to this closing section for this literary unit, where they are now being redeemed. They are brought here to the temple to this chuppah, possibly to be married. Then we come to the last bit here, for there will be a booth for shade by day from the heat, and for a refuge and shelter from the storm and rain. So there's a little bit of question as to the first word in this verse, which is sukkah. And I'm speaking of the Hebrew here, not the English. The first word that in this verse is sukkah. As I mentioned before, the divisions of chapters and verses is something that came centuries later, and we shouldn't feel bound to them. But it's possible that that could have belonged to the previous statement, and so it should possibly read here, for over all the glory there will be a canopy and a booth. And that would make this next line to read, and she will be for shade by day from the heat, and for a refuge and shelter from the storm and the rain. The question is, what's the antecedent of she if it's not booth? It might be that it is Mount Zion itself. That is one way to translate this and to simply rearrange the words. It is unusual for the word booth to appear as the first word in the sentence. In Hebrew, generally the verb is the first word of the sentence and then the subject follows afterward. But in this case, the subject is the first word, which causes some people to scratch their head and wonder if it might not simply belong in the previous verse. We don't know. But this idea of a sukkah is interesting. A sukkah is a booth. You may have already recognized it from the holiday of Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. Sukkah is translated as tabernacle. When you say Feast of Tabernacles, it's the Feast of Booths is really a better translation. It is also been used in Isaiah once already. It's not a terribly common word either, but it was used back in chapter 1, where it mentioned the daughter of Zion, that she would be left like a sukkah in a vineyard. So this seems to have specific application to the daughter of Zion. And in chapter 1, Isaiah used this word to describe her state of abandonment, that she was left like a sukkah in a vineyard, like a cottage in a field of cucumbers, or like a city besieged, is the other thing he said. So it was meant to indicate that Zion had fallen and was left abandoned. Now we're saying that there will be a sukkah for her. And depending on how we read it, it is that sukkah that will be both shade from the heat and a refuge from storm and rain. Generally, a booth's not a great refuge for storm and rain. So it does make me wonder if this really should be talking about Mount Zion will be the shelter and so forth. But we don't know. But the idea here is definitely one of protection. So we start out with the idea of 7 women looking for an honorable house to which they can belong. We wind up with cleansing the daughters of Zion from the filth and the blood of Jerusalem. We present them at the temple to a chuppah, which is a marriage canopy. And at the temple, there is the glorious pillar of fire. And here they are given a state of protection, and I would assume honor, that they have been seeking. And so this might just all be a conclusion to that initial verse. It definitely is a complete reversal of chapter 3, where we saw the daughters of Zion being humiliated and taken captive. We are now leaving them with a message of hope that they are redeemed. And if you recall, we started chapter 2 with a message of hope with Mount Zion and the temple being established on the top of the mountains. Then we went to a longer period talking about judgments and calamities that would befall, culminating in chapter 3, where the daughters of Zion themselves will experience this harsh abandonment. And now we wrap it up in verse 4 with Mount Zion is going to be restored. The temple is coming back. The branch will be here as part of this. And the daughters of Zion have now been changed to the bride. That's chapter 4, kind of a short chapter. If you found this useful, please like, subscribe, tell your friends about it. And let's see if we can get some more people watching these videos, because Isaiah is worth studying. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.